Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. All right, so welcome to the show, everybody. Today I'm here with one of my closest friends in Asheville, Jess Amendola. And let me give you a little bit of background on Jess. I'm just going to give him a little bit of story how you and I met. So here in Asheville, I was here, I think you were like one of the first people I met when I first came back. And we were at the Sauna House, which if you're an Asheville local, it's one of our favorite places. And Jess and I just started vibing on talking about personal development stuff. And just, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but and maybe some of you guys can relate, but part of what, I've done a lot of self-development work. And so, in a sense, I thought I had it, kind of all figured out, right? So you and I are talking, and you're bringing up stuff about child wounds and emotional integrity and just different things that we were vibing on. And finally, I was like, you know what? I'd like to work with you. I'd like to do a couple sessions with you. And so the first session I did with Jess literally blew my mind, because you can imagine it's kind of like going into this space, and Jess kind of brings you into this sort of deep meditative state when she does some of her work, at least the work I did with her. And I kind of woke up to the fact during this process that I did not have it all figured out, that I had some definite things that I was stuck on. And we'll talk a little bit about that Jess sort of pointed me towards. And 2 in particular. One was child wounds around the mother that Jess allowed me to see. Now, this was something I was aware of before, but I don't think I was aware of it to the degree that you and I worked on it. And then the other thing that I just thought I completely had figured out, because a lot of you who follow me and a lot of people who listen to this know I'm very much into the Stoics and very much into the way that they are with emotions. And Jess kind of immediately pointed out to me that I was not in my emotional integrity in several ways, and primarily in the way of expressing sadness, which is pretty typical of a male. And I was a little bit resistant to that at first until we started getting deep into the session, and then we did another session. And just to kind of sum it all up, it really cracked open for me a whole new way of looking at things. It made me more receptive to relationships with women. It made me understand some of my child wounds. It took me to a whole other level almost immediately. And so that's why I wanted you all to be able to get introduced to Jess, and that's why I wanted you on the Next Level Human podcast, because to me, this work blew me away. And if I've been doing self-development for all these years, right, like pretty much since my early 20s, and didn't get this kind of education. To me, I imagine many other people who are doing this work are not really getting this education. So I want to, start with, why don't you just give us an orientation, wherever you want to start, in terms of how you came to this work and what this work is like, and then we can begin to get into any direction you want. I certainly have some things I would love to cover, but I want you to kind of go in the direction you want to orient people into sort of your approach and what you think is going on with people who are stuck in their old wounds and old patterns and old history.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of that. I think one thing I want to point out that you said is the whole not crying and not expressing sadness is very common in men, and I just want to say that that's very common in a lot of people. I was actually I didn't cry for like 8 years straight. And it got to a point where I remember trying to cry, and I think you said this too. I remember trying to cry, and I couldn't. And so that was a big sign for me of like, okay, something's going on here, you know. And so I started doing this work. I mean, I feel like I've been a seeker my whole life, in many lives. But I would say probably about 15 years ago, I started really diving into personal development, healing work, trauma healing work, and having a child really propelled a lot of that, and it brought up a lot of my own inner child wounds. And I just became fascinated with it and really had a new understanding about how this is something that many adults are carrying. And, you know, we get so comfortable in our way of living that we don't often see it in ourselves. And I think that's why it can be helpful to have a reflection back from someone that can say like, hey, you know, in a loving way, not crying is not a good thing. You know, it's a sign of, I love this way of defining emotion. It's energy in motion. So the emotion needs to move through your body, whether it's sadness, anger, joy, you know, any emotion. And so that's just like one kind of clue, you know, that we uncovered, and it was pretty cool to watch your transformation with that. But so I would say a lot of the work does revolve around inner child stuff, and we can maybe get into that a little bit more later. But I think that was a really beautiful place we started, was really unraveling some of the stuff in childhood, because I do think sometimes people can get caught up in like right now without looking at the root of it. So, you know, the way we're behaving right now often is something we developed in childhood. Yeah,
so let me see, and maybe I'll just recite this to you and tell me if I'm getting this right, if this is the way you see it. So one of the ways I feel like you helped me understand this is that if I'm living right now, so I'm 48-year-old male, right, and I'm going through my life, and I have certain things that I'm doing, and I think that I am got it all figured out in career in different areas. But there's certain patterns, and for me, they were largely around relationships with women that I have had throughout my life. And of course, at 48, I thought I had dealt with a lot of that stuff.
Sure.
And what you, I think, pointed out to me is like, Jade, these wounds when you were a kid, even though you had a great childhood upbringing from your perspective, one of the things you said to me is like, you know, trauma is not a comparison thing. You know, just because you weren't physically or mentally abused, you still had trauma as a kid. Like one of the things you and I talked about was this episode I had where I remember my mom, me and my siblings were all downstairs, and she was freaking out because the house was a mess. She's a young woman, like at what, 28, she had 4 kids. So she's trying to figure this out. She has childhood wounds herself. But all I remember is her crying and screaming, sitting down, and this is going to get me choked up just talking about it here, right? She's sitting down and saying, I don't want to be here anymore. So as a little kid, I'm thinking to myself, what's she talking about? She don't want to be here. Is she going to like kill herself? Is she just going to leave us? Like, it scared the hell out of me as a little child. Now, I remember that, and I remember you sort of pointing me to these sort of episodes that happen and saying right there as a child, you don't know how to deal with that. So you start to create certain compensatory mechanisms or way of behaving to protect yourself that can then follow you through your life. Even at 48 years old, when you think you've got it all figured out, these things can be inhibiting your ability to get close to someone. And so I feel like this was my understanding. Now, am I getting that right from your perspective, or am I missing anything?
That's absolutely correct. But another piece that I would even add to that is not only are you kind of molding yourself to, you know, accommodate for how your mother's behavior was and how it was affecting you, but you're also going to start attracting in people to model her behavior because that's what you're familiar with. So, you know, until we can heal that, I would bet that you probably attracted a lot of partners that had similar behaviors as your mom, maybe emotionally unpredictable or, and I would like to just say one thing too, while we're getting into this, is that doing inner child work does not mean that there was anything wrong with your parents. It's not to say like, if your mom's listening, it's not to fault her or my mom. It's simply that as children, we have a lot of needs and we're very sensitive and, a lot of times our parents are just doing the best that they can and even modeling what they were given as children. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, because I do have some clients that are like, well, my parents were great. My mom was very loving. It's not to say that they weren't. It's just to say that there was a need that didn't get met.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, Jess, because my mother, I think she knew. I've talked to her since, as me and my mother are very close, but I think one of the things that happened to her when we were young is her mother was pretty terrible to her. And she would catch herself, I think, when she was at her worst or overwhelmed. I think she would almost catch herself and glimpse herself behaving like her mother did. Yeah. And I think that would scare the hell out of her. Like now as an adult, I can say this, but the interesting thing about this that I think you turned me on to is this idea that, I feel like one of the things I got from you is that, Jade, you can discuss a lot of things logically, and you do.
Right.
Like I can logically go, oh, this is why my mother was doing this. But one of the things that I feel like I got for you, it doesn't matter if I understand the logic behind it. The emotion of those moments is still with me until I clear them.
Exactly.
And one of the things I'll say, just to confirm so everyone listening can kind of understand how it was for me, I did indeed with women replay some of my emotional wounds with my mother. I would either get emotionally volatile women, which my mom was, very loving but also very emotionally volatile, or I would get women who were the exact opposite and were kind of more closed off and very stoic.
Right.
And I don't know that either one of those worked well for me, right? Because like me in my natural self is I'm very goofy, playful, want to laugh a lot, but also want to be very sort of intellectual. And so I would either choose one of these things was more emotionally volatile and more, but also more fun in a sense, or things that were kind of more boring. And I could never balance those two until I started working with some of the stuff you sort of were doing. So I don't know if that resonates with you and other clients, that you see that they sometimes go the opposite. But I do think I kind of went the opposite of my mom at times too.
Yeah, I think that could maybe even fall under the category of what sometimes we call protest behavior, where it's like you're almost protesting your mother by choosing someone that's the direct opposite to see how that might go. But yeah, I mean, it's very normal that if you had a parent that would have these explosive emotions, it could maybe even be boring to be in a healthy relationship. Like, where's the excitement? Where's, like, even though it's screaming and it feels scary, your body is recognizing that as like, it's the same as excitement in your body. So it's like, it almost feels maybe scary to that person to be in a healthy relationship.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that. So let me ask you this: how do people get started with this kind of work? So if people who are listening, either on the podcast or we're actually doing this live also while we're doing the podcast, like how do they get started? Like, how would you know? How would someone know if they have old wounds, from their childhood, or even, like sometimes it's not necessarily childhood, right? Like I oftentimes think about it, and tell me if I get this right, but I oftentimes think, we have a few big wounds as children, then sort of as teenagers we go through some stuff, and then in our early 20s we have some traumatic events. Yeah. But any traumatic event really can trigger some of this, correct? And how would you know that you're stuck, right? Okay. That you've got like some kind of emotional issue that you need to deal with, or you could benefit from dealing. Could all of us deal with it? Like, is it there for all of us, or are there very specific people and very specific signs?
I believe everyone could benefit from it. And it's important also when talking about trauma to acknowledge that trauma is not just these big, massive things like, going to war, sexual abuse, physical abuse, major violence. As a 2-year-old baby, your mother leaving the room and you being left alone in the dark, which was very common for a lot of our age group, the cry it out method. I believe that is a trauma to a little baby, who just needs nurturing and love from their mother. So I think it's important to acknowledge that you know, the word trauma can kind of turn some people off, but I personally believe everyone has some kind of trauma in their lives that they can work through. And I think some of the signs would be certainly not being able to cry, I think is a big one. If you're struggling to have healthy partnerships, if you find that you get easily triggered and maybe lose control of your emotions, I think that's a pretty big sign. A lot of people also will find that they don't have a lot of memories from their childhood. That was something specifically that I struggled with. And doing this work, honestly, that was one of the biggest gifts for me as I started having all these memories come back. It was like kind of being given that again. So I think that's another one. But definitely I would say you're going to mainly see it come up in your closest relationships, you know, and a lot of people I think can avoid even entering into a partnership because that is going to be all your shit is going to be right in front of you. You know, the partner is the mirror, and that's the person you're around closest to. You're intimate with them. They see that depth of you that most other people don't. And so I think looking at your partnership is going to be a great first step, you know. Are there areas in your partnership where you struggle? Or do you struggle to be honest, to speak how you're feeling, you know, stuff like that?
Yeah, you know, that's interesting because I oftentimes could see, like we were talking about, like I saw my patterns in romantic relationships.
Yeah.
And obviously you and I talk about romantic relationships a lot. And those of you who listen to the podcast know I cover this a lot because I share your view that it is the most important relationship. It's almost like simultaneously a parent-child relationship because our romantic partners parent us in a sense. But it also is this unique sort of best friend relationship. So it's parent, best friend. And then I think the thing that makes it so is the intimacy and the physical connection of a lover. And that just brings you to a whole other depth. And your dysfunctions are on full display. I oftentimes say when I get in a relationship, I'm like, I kind of can't wait to see the dysfunctions, not from a negative point of view, but more from the fact that once I begin to see that, and I think a lot of people avoid that, but then I say, once I begin to see the dysfunctions in my romantic partner, I know, I take it as a gift almost that she is sharing this and feels safe enough to be sort of her full self. And to kind of think about, or just to add something, and just tell me if you agree with this or not. Like one of the things that I think you were pointing me to is patterns, right? So repeated patterns, and not necessarily negative patterns, but more like I tended to be in most of my romantic relationships secure, but leaning a little bit distant, leaning a little bit avoidant, leaning a little bit aloof, right? So it'd almost be like, I don't want to make defined plans. I want to keep you a little bit at a distance. It was kind of this on again, off again thing. Like I love quality time with you, but then I want to, you know, kind of push you away. And some of that is natural for me, but I think that spotting some of those things allowed me to see, oh, this is kind of me protecting myself a little bit. And I didn't necessarily pick up on that before. And so would you say then for people who are interested in this work that these patterns point you to this? And by the way, I want to say one thing before you answer that for those of you listening. One of the things we know, just because, you know, obviously I do all metabolism stuff as well, but one of the things we know is that adverse child events, and what I think Jess is telling us, these don't have to be the big abuses like we think. Obviously those, but also small things like my mom screaming and yelling in a moment of weakness saying she's going to leave is a big trauma for a kid. And we do now know that these adverse childhood events mess with the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal, thyroid, ovarian axes. And so we might not think about this, but this has direct impact on metabolic function because our metabolism is just one big stress barometer. And so rather than calling it trauma, maybe we should call it fixed stress. Fixed stress that has been there since we were kids that needs to kind of be released. And so I don't know if you have anything to say about any other things to say about these patterns that come up, but I'm curious if you do. And then if not, I'm wondering, so where would someone start? Where would you typically start someone in this process?
Yeah. So touching on the pattern thing first, I will say that when you're first starting this out, it can be really hard to even see your own patterns. And I think that, like I said earlier, I think that is one reason it can be helpful to have someone in your life that you can trust and you feel safe with who can help you see those. Because I know when I first started, and like you said too, you know, you didn't see some of these things.
No.
I didn't see mine. I had someone came into my life who was really wise to this stuff and started helping me see it. So that would be one thing, is if you aren't seeing them, you know, there's nothing wrong with you. It's great that you're even aware and wanting to look for that. But it, you know, just so you know, it's normal to not know what your patterns are. But certainly if you are seeing them, I would say starting with inner child work would be the easiest thing to do on your own from where you're at. It's a very beautiful process. I've been doing it for years, and I still do it. I wouldn't say every day, but a few times a week. It'll come up, and I'll connect with my inner child, and that has been, I mean, so huge on my healing journey. And I really like that because it's, like I said, it's something you can do on your own. You don't have to just work with a therapist. Now, if you are somebody that's experienced some of those really, really, really big things like physical, sexual abuse, you might want to work with a therapist on this because it can open up a lot. Yeah. And you know, just to be cautious of that, I would say.
So it'd be like working with you, for, let's say, along with a therapist, or
sure,
or a therapist alone, because the work you do is so. It seems, you know, I've done a lot of process stuff,
right.
you know, therapy type of things, and
yeah.
it's a lot of talk therapy, but it doesn't necessarily get. It doesn't really get to the heart of the matter as fast as the stuff you do does. So I almost feel like it would be beneficial for those who really have big issues, having a therapist who's trained in that stuff, but also I still think you could benefit from this work, you know?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I do directly with my clients often, and I feel really comfortable holding that space. So I would say if, you know, whether it's me or a therapist or a friend even, or your partner. Now, I would typically probably steer away from the partner. I find that people maybe won't go as deep as they could. Unless, you know, if it's someone obviously that you've been with for a long time, like no judgment there. But yeah, this is work that I do often with clients, and holding safe space for that. And the way that I kind of do my coaching, you know, my intention always is to give you tools that you can do on your own. I don't want to bring people in and make you feel like you need me forever, you know, or like you have to keep working with me to get your healing. My goal is to give you the tools to remind you how powerful you are, and you know, that you can do this stuff on your own, and to build you up to a place where you feel comfortable doing that.
So well, how would this look then for me? Would you bring me in and basically allow me to invoke that little boy? Like, how old was he? 6 years old? Am I literally coming back to that memory and speaking to little Jade and parenting him in some way, or coaching him in some way? Like, what does it actually look like to do sort of this inner child work? Like, what would I be doing?
So typically when I start people on this work, we go through a meditation, and that meditation is basically going to drop you into a state where you're open to receiving this. And it's basically going to connect you back with your inner child, that little child self, so little Jade. And you know, it's interesting, for each client, the age could be different. Like the age that comes back for you might be 4, might be 12. So we connect with that child, and essentially you want to like feel into that little boy. So for me, there's a memory in the house I grew up in, where I'm just standing in our dining room. And so anytime I need to connect with my inner child, I'll kind of like, it's almost like I go back into that little body, and I'm standing there again. And I just remember what that feels like to be her with, you know, this sweet little girl with a huge heart that, you know, cared so much about others and animals, and, you know, and I remember what that feels like to be her. And so the interesting thing with inner child work is I can simultaneously play the part of my little girl, as well as my older wise self. And the Jess now has the tools that little Jess didn't. So, you know, in the areas where she needed someone and she didn't get what she needed, I'm able to show up and say, hey, I'm here. I can hold you through this, you know. And it might sound kind of kooky. I remember like first hearing about this and was like, okay, that sounds so freaking weird. But don't knock it till you try it. Like it's been life-changing for me.
Yeah. And actually, I'll actually lend some science to this because so there's a technique in PTSD that is one of the most effective techniques. It's called story editing. And I think you know all about this, but I'll just tell everybody who's listening to this. And what story editing essentially does is it brings you back to an event. And what you do is you write the story exactly as it happened, right? So let's say in this case with me and this traumatic moment as a child where my mom was threatening to leave, I would go and I'd write the event. I'd write everything I remember about that event. And so I'm basically, again, dropping into the energetic and emotional charge of that moment. And then where the healing happens in PTSD is to write the story now forward, right? Yeah. And oftentimes that story will be written from where you are today at 48. It's basically taking those lessons and essentially saying, based on this having happened to me, it taught me this, it taught me that. It got me to this place. And so you're writing into the future with story editing and essentially saying, here's how it healed me, here's how it made me better as a human. And what they've shown in the research is that this dissipates a lot of the emotional charge around it because you're giving meaning to a traumatic event. And that's and you're making sense of the traumatic event. And so while what you do is slightly different than this, to me, I oftentimes think, I was like, oh, it's very similar in some ways to this because it does go back to this, you know, this moment of this little boy or this little girl who's struggling and doesn't have the tools, and then essentially having the adult us step in and write the story and say, no, this is how you can make this mean something. So just for those of you who are wondering what the science is on this, there's a really cool body of work with story editing that you can look up to kind of see that I think relates to this. Although I think the way you do this is far more powerful because one, it's guided. Because what happens when I've done story editing in the past, I can get lost in that emotion, right? And I can begin to lose myself in a sense, or go off on blame, complain, and you know all of these things. Where someone like you pulls me back and essentially says, Jade, you know, reconnect with that little boy. Like I think you brought me to, I can't remember, I think you brought me to like one of my places as a little kid was being outside in the woods right by my house. And I think you brought me to that place, which was my safe place. And then I met myself in that space to talk to that child. So I don't know if you have anything to say with that, but I just wanted to throw that in there because there is actually, as woo-woo as this can sound, which by the way, it doesn't matter because you know, there's a ton of woo that will never be proven that's highly effective. But this actually does have a basis in a good research base that goes along with it, I think.
I think really quick, if it's okay with you, I'm going to share an example of how I've used this.
Yeah, I would love that.
So when I started doing this work, so just for some background information, I was diagnosed with CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is essentially someone that has had many big traumatic experiences, and it's like multiple cases of PTSD.
It's like PTSD on steroids, basically, for those of you who don't know. This is like the worst of the worst PTSD.
So it's hard to function in everyday life, to be honest. And so when I started really diving into this work in a deep meditative state one day, I remember asking kind of like to God or my higher self, whatever, please show me where this started. Like, where did my PTSD start? And so I was immediately taken back to an experience. I was around 12 and I was laying in my bed, and this very scary, to a 12-year-old, big man comes in my house's back door. And without going into too many details that, you know, aren't mine to share, I remember in that moment feeling like I was about to die. Like, this man to me looked terrifying. There was this thin piece of plywood separating my room and my brother's room, and I could see through the crack, and I was watching him, and I just kept having this visual of him killing my brothers and then opening that and killing me. And so in that moment, my body essentially like froze. It got stuck in that, fight, flight, freeze. It got stuck in the freeze state. And all I could think to do was lay down under the cover, pull it over, and like, essentially I was waiting to be killed. And so having that memory come back, the way that I've used this work is, I can go back into that state. And so I've done this a couple ways. One way where I go back and I'm her again. I'm little 12-year-old Jess, and I lay there and I tell myself, I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe. And I try to get my nervous system to relax. And then the other way I've done this is coming in as 35-year-old Jess, and I've actually like closed my eyes and imagined myself rubbing my hand on her back and telling her, hey, you're safe. Everything is okay. This feels really scary right now, but you're not going to die, and that might sound extreme, but that is how I felt in that moment. I truly thought I was about to die. And so that's just kind of like a real life example that I've used that totally shifted the energy of that experience for me. And so it allowed that stuck energy of fear to move through my body, in a safe way, because now I can handle it. I can handle it, and I also know that I didn't die. I can see I didn't die. I'm fine. Everything's okay. Your brothers didn't die, And so that's just kind of like a real life example. Of course, there's plenty of others. Like one time I was a little kid and we had this special cake for the dinner, and I walked over and I dropped it, and I felt so horrible. And that was a moment that stuck with me. So I can go back and like, hey, it's okay that you made a mistake. It's okay that it dropped. Nobody cares that much about the cake, and you kind of like, you're almost coaching your little inner child. And it allows these things to be free, so they're not stuck anymore.
Yeah, and actually I can give you guys a real world example of what happened after working with Jess. One of the things I said to her is during the process, I didn't cry, which oftentimes Jess says you will. But she told me, don't worry, you might see some emotional stuff kind of pop up. And my sense as a man, just so everyone I'm sure a lot of men feel this way and a lot of women may feel this way as well. But one of the things that I thought that wasn't clear to me is I always thought crying's no big deal. But like on the inside, one of the things I saw from working with you is that I did think it was a big deal. I kind of saw it as, I did see it as weakness. I did see it in the typical way we oftentimes think men see it. And what's really interesting is about 2 days after the second time I worked with you, I'm sitting with my parents and telling them something, and I looked at them and said, hey, I'm getting ready to start crying. I don't want it to scare you guys. And I wasn't scared. And even though my dad kind of like, his eyes, he had never seen emotion out of me like that. And I began to cry. And what was interesting about me crying was it did not feel weak at all. It was like I was in full control of it. And I was like letting them know that I'm going to cry. It's fine. I love it. I need this release. And I love that you guys are here. Two of my best friends are here with me. So I cried with my parents at the dinner table after this. And it was a really interesting thing, not because necessarily just from the cry. It was something changed in me sort of pretty profoundly. And I remember driving home the 2 hours back to Asheville after that. And I think I told you this. I was like, I think I'm ready for like a real relationship. So it's like so something sort of moved in me that was like, I think I'm ready for like, a powerful relationship or a real relationship. And shortly after that, I met the girl who I'm seeing now, which is really interesting. And it's very fun. It's very light, me and her, but it also just feels a different charge attached to it. And it came directly out of me holding in this emotion of whatever this wound was of not feeling, and I think what it is, and you pointed me to this, not feeling safe with women, right? Like not feeling, and what I mean by that is not feeling emotionally supported by women. And releasing that in front of my mom with the coaching of your work actually, literally freed me from that almost immediately. And it was just so beautiful. And I had never thought to think that, just allowing that emotion to flow out of me. Now, of course, there was some prep work you and I did to get to that point. But hopefully it illustrates for people listening to this why it's important. One of the things I want to know from you is like, so with these emotions, tell us a little bit more, if you can, about how you see them. Like how do we, because to me, I always oftentimes see there's logic and there's emotion, and I like to sort of combine the two, but you sort of push me to sort of look at emotions a little differently and take them more seriously.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I actually wanted to touch on this a little bit as well. But for those just tuning in, earlier I spoke on energy in motion. So emotion is energy in motion. And I think, it's so interesting, the whole boys aren't supposed to cry, but I even got girls aren't supposed to cry. My brothers would tease me so much if I cried. And that's kind of how I learned not to cry. And I think that's so common in a lot of our generation. And for me, and this is another thing I would tell anybody listening, aside from inner child work, I think one of the most powerful things you can do to process some of this and to do some of this work is, when you feel an emotion coming on, whatever that emotion is, let it come through you, because a lot of times we avoid it. So like sadness, for example, I've found when I do this, when I practice, like I'm feeling sadness coming on, for one thing, don't try to rationalize or understand why. It's not important. Like, we do a lot of this work to uncover the stories to help us get there. But if something's coming up, it's more important just to feel it and let it come out than to try to figure out why. It's real right now. Like, it doesn't matter where it came from, And so I like to tell my clients, not only let yourself feel it, but exaggerate it. Make it as big as you can. Give yourself 5 minutes to have a temper tantrum or cry your eyes out or whatever it is. And, the coolest thing is it passes. It passes so quickly when you do that. But when we don't do that, that's when that energy gets stuck in the body. And I mean, you could maybe speak to the science of this, but I believe that those energies getting stuck is a big reason for sicknesses, and possibly cancers. I mean, I probably shouldn't make that claim, but that's just my personal belief.
You're certainly not the only one making that claim.
Yeah.
And I think what we're talking about now gets into things that I think we will. I have, my hypothesis too, and it tends to agree with you actually, that I do think we don't realize that emotions are directly connected to metabolic function, that we are subtle energies as much as we are physical bodies in a sense. And I think the fields of quantum biology and quantum metabolism, which, I know people haven't necessarily heard those terms, but it's basically taking quantum physics and seeing how quantum physics moves biology and metabolism. And I think that's where we're going to learn about that stuff. But it's interesting, right? Because we don't know a whole lot about it yet.
Right.
Yet we have practitioners like yourself who are using this stuff and seeing profound changes. So part of the reason I know you're saying that is because you've worked with people with illnesses and seen, it's a bad word to talk about, this stuff curing or doing whatever, but that's what's happening. People processing through emotional stuff and healing in profound ways. Like think about even complex PTSD, what you dealt with, right? Like that, people having that typically, I mean, these are people who can end up in, insane asylums and, basically just completely deranged.
Yes.
This can be debilitating. Yes. And this work can do profound things, but not just for emotional and mood issues, but also for physical issues. So as crazy as it might sound to people, I'm on board with you there, and I think in the future we're gonna see this. Now, of course, it may not look exactly like you and I hypothesize.
Right.
Well, the mechanisms may not be what we currently completely know, but I believe the science is there for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and on that note of the CPTSD, I can recall sitting with a therapist prior to doing this work and saying, I need medication. I am literally going to kill myself. I cannot live like this. And this was truly debilitating. And it was a daily thing that I struggled with. So, I think mental health issues are a huge sign of stored trauma, or things to work through. But yeah, I mean, definitely, I believe physical ailments too. They say like lung issues are related to anger, and stuff in your hips is stored sadness. So
yeah, and some of this stuff is as much as we want to poo-poo some of the stuff like traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine, some of cultures have already worked some of this out. And, you know,
Mm-hmm.
maybe they're right
Yeah.
in certain areas, maybe they're wrong, but I think most of us who work in this field
Yeah.
have seen enough. And when I say this field, the natural medicine field,
Mm-hmm.
even myself, who's worked mostly with metabolism, I've seen enough people work through emotional issues
Mm-hmm.
and have profound changes in some of their physical
Yeah.
complaints that I am convinced that there is
Mm-hmm.
something here. Like it's
Absolutely.
I don't necessarily need the science, you know, to
Mm-hmm.
you know to back it up. I just know
Yeah.
that it's there. So why don't we talk a little bit about you know, sort of to wrap this up. How does this work? Because one of the things that I've seen for myself
Mm-hmm.
moving through this is that unlike talk therapy, where you kind of need to kind of go back and talk, you
Right.
know, over and over again. This seems to be something that you can do after the fact with sort of other people. Like you mentioned,
Yeah.
things like, you know, your lover or your family members or this kind of stuff. Like, how long does it take? How many sessions does it take to kind of get to a point where you're off on your own? And obviously, I imagine, like, I'm just wondering how it works for most of your clients. Do they, is it sort of like they dealt with this and then there's another thing to deal with and there's always something to deal with? And to what degree do they need to come back and do this work versus, you know, sort of being able to get it from friends, family, and other people?
Right.
Because, you know, ideally, you know, we would have our friends, family, peers, lovers, you know, coworkers be able
Yeah.
to be supportive in this way. I'm just not so sure that that's always possible. So I'm just
Yeah.
curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely varies. You know, it depends on how much we're working with and how much you come in carrying, to be honest. I mean, I would say those with a lot of heavy traumatic experiences to work through, I would say minimum 6 months working together, possibly longer, but it definitely varies person to person. You know, I have some clients that'll come just for a 2-hour session and we'll kind of work through this one big thing and I'll give them a tool that they can use on their own. But, you know, like I shared earlier, my goal really is to give you tools that you can do on your own. And eventually you won't even need your lover or your friend to support you. You'll feel so solid in your own self and holding that space for you that, you know, for me, inner child work is just like, it's such a casual thing now. It's like, oh, I'll sit in my car. Hey, you know, I love you. You're awesome. So it definitely varies. You know, a lot of my work in the course that I'm offering is called Remembering You. And I call it that because I believe that with these tools, we can kind of unlayer some of this stuff that's covering up our own inner wisdom and our own ability to know what we need for healing. And so my goal with all of the work and all of the clients is just to help you remember that God consciousness within that has all the answers and everything that you need, so that you don't need to keep going back to someone.
Yeah. One of the amazing things, I just want to share this about you for everyone watching, because I just think this is so amazing about you. So as you get to know Jess, you'll see she's doing a lot of things. She's a single mother. She is constantly dealing with, you know, issues around that, being a single mom and like the divorce and all this kind of stuff that can be. And I think I oftentimes used to think, I think before meeting you, and maybe because of the stuff with my mom, is that this stuff is, you know, really hard stuff. But you're someone who just does this incredibly gracefully. In other words, there's never been a moment where I've talked to you or run into you where it's not just like, you're just not happy and in joy. Although I have run in times where you're sad, and you oftentimes will say, like I remember one time we were talking on the phone, or maybe it was a voice message. You said you'll have to, you'll actually didn't even say you'll have to forgive me. It was just more like, I'm a little sad right now, and it's almost like I can see you talking to this little girl, Jess. But I am amazed at how graceful some of the stuff that you, since I've known you, that you're going through, that I don't even think you see it as necessarily a big deal. I just go, wow, it's amazing how well you just handle all this. And for me, being in the medical field and knowing all about complex PTSD, it's amazing, right? That to have someone so grounded and so functional, despite having all the emotions and dealing with all of the things. And so why don't you I just want, it's really amazing to see it in action. And I would say I've had a lot of the same things. I always this is what's funny and embarrassing. I say this to you a lot, but I'm like, oh, I got it. I had it all figured out. Typical male Finn, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I got it. I'm good. And then I'm like, ooh, I'm not very good. Like, but since then, I've been a whole lot better, and it has opened up this idea that, oh, I'm not good. Like, I got work to do, and I want to do this work.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any final things to say, but I do want you to tell people how they get in touch with you for the, I don't even know if you have how much, time you have for clients or whatever, but just give us an idea. Any final thoughts? And then also if people do want to work with you, like how is that possible? And if so, how?
So final thoughts, I would love to just say that if you are someone listening and you feel like a bit overwhelmed perhaps by the work that you feel like you need to do, like I've been there, and I don't know, I like to use my story as an example of like, you can get to the other side, and I do. I feel so grounded and happy in my life now, and it's like, it's something, 10 years ago, I could have never imagined feeling this free. And so it is so worth doing the work, but also, just don't be overwhelmed thinking about how much there is to do, like one step at a time. So for anybody that is interested in working with me, I do have a few spots open currently for one-on-one work. This is done over Zoom. So I typically like to do a 6-month program, but we can talk about your needs and what's best for you. The way to do that, there's an application on my website you can fill out, and we'll set up a consultation call. I also have a course coming up. It's the Remembering You course. It's an online course. We will be meeting live, but you don't have to be present. We'll record it and send it to you if you can't make it. But essentially, that course is going to be doing, the inner child work, but also other practices that are similar to help you kind of uncover and unlayer some of this stuff that's blocking you from accessing your own inner wisdom. And then in late February, for anybody that wants to take a trip over here, I have a women's retreat. It's the Remembering You Women's Retreat. It's at these beautiful luxury cabins, and we'll be, just having a really beautiful container with private chef. Everything's taken care of for you, but also diving into some of this work in a beautiful, safe container together.
Man, that's cool. I hope you do one for men eventually.
I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
I've gotten a couple requests. Yeah.
I just think that's super powerful. All right, so the website is jessamendola.com.
It's actually Jessica Amendola.
So jessicaamendola.com is the website, and then at Jess Amendola, right?
Yep.
On Instagram for those you want to connect with Jess there.
Yeah.
And I love you, my friend. Thanks for being
having
here.
me.
It's the best.
Thank you for everyone listening.
Thanks everybody for hanging out. We'll see you next time.